Well, once upon a time, in the time before time was stretched on the rack of infinite progress, when time was still alive, in drum time, in song time, in story time, in the time of the heartbeat, before time, beyond time, underneath the time, in between a time, once upon a time like that, there was a village. And in that village, they had great celebrations. And when they had their celebrations, they sang. And each one sang their own song, because it was understood by those people that when a man or a woman reached a certain age, a song would come to them, and it would be their song, and it would be their gift to the community and to the celebrations. But there was one man who sat in the shadows, who sat on the edge of those celebrations. And when people saw him, they said, and they shook their heads, "Oh, that poor fellow. You know, he doesn't have a song. Strange." And they called him No Song. So this fellow, he spent a lot of time alone, and in that time, he took up the bow and arrow, and he learned to hunt. And he became a very proficient hunter. He knew all the ways, and he knew all the plants, and he knew all the animals. He knew them better than he knew the people. And because he was able to take so much game, maybe after a time, a strange idea occurred to him. And the more he thought about it, the more this idea took hold, until it became irresistible. And the idea was this, that he would hunt and gather as much food as he possibly could, and get a huge pot, and make a great stew for no one in particular, just to see if he could do it. And it would be a stew of great abundance. And so he began to work out this idea, and he began to hunt and trap, and he gathered all the different kinds of meat, and he gathered wild herbs and onions to season this stew. And he made a fire, and he began the work of stirring this cauldron and adding the ingredients, each in their appropriate moment. Now it happened that Coyote was wandering in that part of the world at that time, and he caught the scent of something which made him drool. He caught the scent of something so delicious that it took him off his chosen path and turned him in a different direction. And before long, Coyote was standing in the edge of the yellow light of the fire of No Song. And soon enough, the aroma overwhelmed him, and he stepped into the light and revealed himself to No Song. And he said, "What will you take in exchange for that stew of abundance?" "Well," said No Song, "well, Coyote, since you are the maker of songs, I know exactly what I would like. I would like a song. Will you give me a song for this stew?" Well, Coyote scratched his head, and he said, "Well, I could do that, but what kind of a song would you like?" And No Song didn't hesitate. He knew exactly what kind of a song he wanted. "I want a song that is the most beautiful song that people have ever heard. I want a song that will inspire the people and move them. I want a sacred song that can be sung at all the sacred occasions, that will move the hearts of the people and astonish them. I want a song like that." Coyote said, "Well, I could do it, but there are conditions." "If you sing this song at wrong times and in wrong places, I'll have to come back and take it away." Well, No Song was offended at this suggestion. "How could you suggest that I would mishandle such a song? I would never sing it at wrong times and in wrong places. I would treat it with the greatest reverence and the greatest respect." "Well, all right then. It's a deal. Just so you know what you're getting into." So the next festival was a big one. People from other villages had come. It was a great gathering. And everyone was astonished when the one who had never sung before stepped into the middle of the ring, threw back his head, and sang the most beautiful song they had ever heard in their lives. And with tears streaming down their faces and smiles radiating in every direction, they said, "Sing it again! Sing it again! Sing it again!" Well, what could he do? He sang it again, and again, and again, and again. And by the time the dawn came, they had given him a new name. And his name was Singing Wonderfully. And he also had an engagement book of gigs for the next year. He was singing at weddings and birthday parties and, and whenever company came over, his mother would say, "Sing this song." And he traveled. And he didn't have time for hunting anymore. He didn't really spend any time alone. He was busy. You know what I'm talking about. Well, this went on for a long time or a short time or whatever time it takes for a divinity like Coyote to notice that something requires his attention. And so one night, as singing wonderfully, lay sleeping in his bedroll, a hand reached under the tent and into his chest and into his heart and took that song back where it came from. And soon enough, the people said, the poor man, he has no song. This is from the section of the book called The Drum for the Serpent and the Bird. Greatness, as in Alexander the Great, achieves its immortality by building personal history into a monument. Greatness, unlike genius, is superiority, accomplished by decree of structure, by acclamation, renown, reputation, and approval. All of which, however, are substitutes for initiatory transformation and ceremonial confirmation. Okay, so I just want to interject that, I'm not saying that there isn't another kind of greatness that is a curative and generative thing, but I'm talking about this kind of false authority greatness now, all right? So, here's a little Kenneth Patchen. For greatness is only the dray horse that coaxes the built cart out, and reason is where we go. But genius is an enormous littleness, a trickling of heart that covers alike the hare and the hunter. Patchen's opposition, the top-down built cart of greatness against the enormous littleness of bottom-up genius, is perfectly fitted to the contradictions and vast distance between the imposed and the implicate shape of life. With genius as countermyth to greatness, we depart decisively from Howard Gardner's theory of creativity, which holds acclamation within the creative domain as a primary measure of genius. Creativity, he says, is inherently a communal or cultural judgment. Ugh. Thus, rendering a structure-bound view, constrained always to shadow the towering greatness of history's big man. To the contrary, cultural judgment and renown are superfluous for the other within, as for Robert Graves. And I quote, "No public honors, no consensus of other poets, no album of press cuttings, not even the passage of time can give me or anyone else more than the courtesy title of poet. The one sure reward for whatever labors we may have undergone is the continued love of the muse. It's a little clue to where no song went wrong. Genius, then, the guiding source of creativity, is confirmed alone and in the soul. Having thus far explored the necessity, value, and innovations of descent, it remains to establish the imperative of staying paradoxically descended, even in ascent. So this is back to the world tree now and the squirrel. See, by keeping the connection to the roots and the serpent, there's a descendedness. You understand? All right. So there's a quality of descendedness that we do not have in this culture, and we sure as hell don't want it. See. Oh, people floating around, you know, the lack of authentic authority. Yes, that's very good. Yes, yeah. Instead of what does Eliade call it? A recapitulation of an originary act. That's his explanation of the archetypal gesture. Now I'll digress even further. I mentioned in my other reading a word that I had to make, which is archegestic. Archegestic. Because I was getting really tired of saying archetype and typal, and I wanted to get the movement into it, the motion. And gestic refers to, dance. And you were talking about gesture being primary to communication. We read gesture before we read language, right? We also read tonality before we read language, okay? So in this leaping, this squirrel thing, you see, when the squirrel goes down to the serpent is an archai. Also, the thunderbird, the eagle on top, is an archai, right? When the leaping consciousness is working, there's what Hillman calls an epistrophe. It's that reaching back to something, right? And so I saw that what I was more interested in was the energy, the movement of how that happens. And so I made this word archegestic. There's an archegestic leap that happens there. All right. The imperative of staying paradoxically descended even in ascent, remaining faithful to genius even in greatness. As Bly says, the higher the spirit goes, the more deeply the soul sinks down. That's perfect. That's vertical and mythological thinking. We need the gnomon. You know what the gnomon is? On a sundial, the thing that sticks up and casts a shadow, that's the gnomon. All right? And the gnomon is another image of the world tree, the axis mundi. We need the gnomon and its dark shadow. This dynamic is the paradox of verticality and is dramatically illustrated in the polarity of the mythic pair Gilgamesh and Enkidu. In the scholarship of this Mesopotamian epic, Thomas van Noordwijk, speaking of the Gilgamesh figure, has written, "The heroic perspective was a reflection of the preoccupation with renown as a hedge against death, and led to an easy defiance of the reality of death. The trickster, however, introduces death, but the justless emperor demands eternal life. Such a life of greatness, lived as a monument to immortality, is the imposed order of history, the eternal and fixed explicate order of structure, the so-called superior forces of civilization. What I'm referring to there is a quote that came earlier in the book from Ernst Cassirer, who said that we could not have civilization until the forces of myth were conquered. Cassirer. Am I saying that right? I think it's Cassirer. Thank you. Well, you know what Strunk says. If you don't know how to pronounce it, say it loud. The counter myth to such a life, this life of greatness as a monument, the counter myth to such a life is the wild genius of Enkidu. Again, turning to Bly, another instance of vertical thought is the idea that a spiritual twin was born with you. At birth, the two of you separated, and perhaps you might not see your spiritual twin again in this life, although you would always long for her or him. Regarding the wild man Enkidu as the second self, i.e. the spiritual twin, daimon, paraclete, the not I, Nordwick tells us. The second self has the effect of opening up for our consideration the gap between what we see in the sometimes narrow vision of conscious life and the different vista afforded by including truths from the darkness inside us. You want that again? Yeah. The second self has the effect of opening up for our consideration the gap. This is the arc of the leap, right? The gap between what we see in the sometimes narrow vision of conscious life and the different vista afforded by including truths from the darkness inside us. Enkidu, the faceless ancestor of all men, like Cowper's wounded healer, opens that different vista. The counterbalance to greatness, the descensus ad inferos, that's Latin meaning the descent to the interior. The wild man, therefore, exemplifies the deep wisdom most crucial to the other within. Hell's imaginal function. The implicate shape of life. Those deep images lurking in life's history. Understanding with imagination. Enkidu embodies the function of descent. There is a particularly applicable episode in which Gilgamesh, accompanied by Enkidu, received 2 implements from the goddess Inanna. These items are variously translated as stick and hoop, used to play a hockey-like game, or as drum and beater. In either interpretation, they can be said to represent the lost instruments of play and creative expression. The hulupu tree, now we're back to the world tree again. The hulupu tree, from which the drum and beater were made, had 3 inhabitants. The zoo bird in the crown, the goddess Lilith in the trunk, wow, and the snake who knows no charm in the roots. Bird, mammal, reptile. A tripartite image which recalls the Nordic Yggdrasil, the divine ash tree with an eagle on top, a squirrel on the trunk, and the primordial worm gnawing at the roots. Again, bird, mammal, reptile. Hence, the image is the world tree, or axis mundi, which intersects the zones of the shamanic triune cosmos. And this recalls again Robert's the hawk, the rider, and the horse, if you're familiar with those images, which stand for the divisions of a tripartite consciousness. The fact that Inanna wished to be rid of the tree's tenants so as to make the horizontal throne of privilege and the bed of royal birthright of its wood indicates that the valor of triality was already waning in favor of civilization's exploitative one-sidedness. Loss of triality is further suggested by the fact that the bright aspect of the triple goddess, Inanna, wishes to rid herself of her own dark aspect, personified as Lilith. Inanna's determination to cut down the primordial tree is tantamount to Marduk's ritual dismemberment of Tiamat, the cosmogonic act which brings about the new civilized order, an order, and this is, say the name again for me, Kasira. This is Kasira, an order that could not arise until the darkness of myth was fought and overcome. Nevertheless, one cannot dismiss the shamanic significance of this particular drum and beater, especially in connection with the theme of initiatory descent. For as the story goes on, suddenly a chasm opens in the earth. The drum and beater are lost in the depths of the netherworld, whereupon Gilgamesh laments. "Oh, my drum, oh, my beater, my drum with irresistible heart, my beater with dense rhythm unrivaled." Considering Eliada's view that the preeminently shamanic technique is the passage from one cosmic region to another, from earth to sky, or from earth to underworld, one can surmise that when the drum and beater fall into the abyss, they are returned to the original pre-civilized source of shamanic power. Clearly, the drum being made from the root and the beater being made from the crown of the world tree derivatively carry the chaotic serpent and the cosmic bird forward into the new order. It should come as no surprise, then, that when the drum falls, of all present, only the half-civilized Enkidu is willing to descend to the underworld and attempt to retrieve the lost instruments of play and creative expression. Whereupon he proclaims, "I will bring up now the drum from the underworld, land of the dead. I will bring up the beater from the mouth of darkness." The Emperor Gilgamesh, the proverbial insider, I don't mean to bash Gilgamesh, I love Gilgamesh, but I'm using him here, so I'm beating him up a little bit, all right? The Emperor Gilgamesh, the proverbial insider, the architect of civilized order, accepts the wild man's offer of descending to the underworld, but warns him with the following advice. "Do not put on a clean garment. Do not smooth your skin with sweet-smelling oil from the bowl. Do not throw the throwing stick in the underworld. Do not carry a staff of power in your hands. Do not put sandals on your feet. Make no bellow in the place of the cry out of the earth. Kiss not your beloved wife, and strike not the wife you hated. Kiss not your beloved child, nor strike the child you hated." Wow. It seems that the ascending heroic twin, Gilgamesh consciousness, has strong advice for the descending anonymous twin, Enkidu consciousness. Gilgamesh indicates that in order to pass through the underworld unscathed, one ought to resume the original tufty and bristled, uncivilized and wild condition, insisting that one should lay aside the refined emblems and accoutrements of the civil persona. This recommended procedure is identified herein as the false divestiture, a pose portrayed incisively by Deardorff and McNeely in her work on the trickster. This is McNeely. The look is naturally contrived, hair treated so that it looks as if it had never been touched by a comb, clothing made to look beaten and torn. You can buy them in the stores this way, you see. Oversized clothes in layers gives us the charm of clowns or homeless people who must wear all they own. Comfort defines propriety, yet we torture ourselves, tousled perms, tight jeans, etc., to appear comfortable. One way to understand the current love of grunge is to recognize it as a part of the aheroic mystique. And that's her book, Mercury Rising. Deardorff and McNeely. Deardorff, D-E-L-D-O-N. Yeah, and she's a Jungian, but don't hold that against her. Mercury Rising. Yeah, a couple of them. The emphasis on the look of grunge and the comfort stands for the rejection of the stuffed shirt formality of elevationism. This is my term for false authority, elevationism. There's nothing sacred about it. You just want to be higher than everybody else, right? One cannot, however, simply assume the appearance of descendedness, for that is mere renunciation. The true divestiture takes place in the actual descent, as we know particularly from another Sumerian myth, the descent of Inanna. In preparation to enter the great below, Inanna, queen of heaven, is elaborately adorned in the vestments and regalia of her exalted estate. And as she goes down at each of 7 gates, she is ritually divested of one more item. The 7 decrees, the crown of the plain, the rod of lapis lazuli, the stones about her neck, a gold ring, a breastplate, all her garments of ladyship.
You consider those 7 marks of civilization?
Yes. Yeah. And they're the disguise of being a well-fit person, a member of the flock. And they have to be removed. Yes. Until finally naked, Inanna enters the deepest deep. Hence, as proposed from the outset in this book, in the case of the other within, such emblems of status are not renounced, but are initiatorily stripped away. Okay. Maybe that's a good place to just quit. Initiatorily stripped away. Right?
The opposite of, I'll make up words, accoutrement, having a position by how you look. What was Kurt Cobain's problem?
Well, it's not the opposite. It's exactly the same thing. It's exactly the same thing. The grunge look is the regalia of grunge.
But they don't know the mythology.
They don't know the mythology. So this is why I say there's a false divestiture. You're trying to appear that you've been divested. And then there's a true divestiture. And the true divestiture fucks you up. Right? You get stripped down to nothing. Yeah, sure he was. He had, like Robert says, when he talks about Joplin and Hendrix, he had hold of the tail of the firebird. You know, too soon. No, the discipline was not there. Then there was no container for it. You know, so when you have the authenticity and the authority in communion in this leaping way, then it's possible to develop an artful container, a practice, a discipline, which keeps you from just just evaporating.
That word discipline is the one that's being hated a lot in the universities now.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And we have to, and authority is the same. You know, when we take the young men, we have to have a long talk about authority, because nobody trusts authority. Because where is there an authentic authority? So as soon as you say, I'm going to be the authority here, somebody's ready to kill you, because they know that you're going to be lying to them. Yeah.
Cobain's fucking fans shamed him to death because of his success.
Well, it's a problem of projection, isn't it? You know, partly. In other words, I think Robert has talked about this. Maybe, well, yeah, I'll give it to you. What happens when a man hides his limp? Limp, your defect. Someone else has to limp it. And some people get really good at handing off that limp. They hand it off to other people around them to carry for them, and they just float away, you know, lighthearted, no troubles. Is that clear? Yes.
Yeah, I'm puzzled about something. I don't know if it's the false divestiture that you're talking about or something else, but where I live, there's a small college in northern Wisconsin where there are students there that their hair is dirty and all tangled, and they wear dirty, tattered, ragged clothes. You sit across from them in the restaurant and they stink because they obviously aren't bathing. They're eating out of the dumpsters in the garbage cans at the college, but they have trust funds. What's going on there?
Well, I would say they're crying for initiation.
I work in a college too. I think in the case of Cobain, I don't know how current that is, by the way, with young people anymore, but in the case of the grunge ideology and Cobain, I think that he probably was descended based on his story and his addictions. I think he was authentically descended. He was authentically, as a young man, had gone through that ashes stage. What I think may have happened to him, although how would I know, is that all of these other millions of young men and women, some of them trust funders, some of them just normal people, and some of them just typically angst-ridden teenagers, bought into his message and made him a multimillionaire. And there was nothing to bring him up out of the ashes. There was no pathway for that. And there also was no allowance for him to climb out of the ashes. I think it is possible, though, that by his death, that the men who he played with and the other men and women who were part of that scene, although maybe not his wife, were allowed to climb out of, were allowed by that death, by that tragedy, to sort of climb out of it I mean, you hear stories about the other men in his band. One has plays now and is successful on a different level. Another one says he's leaving music and he's going into politics. And also the attention of all those maybe inauthentic fans. I mean, those people change clothes. That was one of them. They change clothes. Now, they're just like the people of the '60s generation. They change clothes and now they're running businesses or corporations or climbing or
The
they're raising
uniforms
children.
change.
Like
The uniforms change. But it's just the fitting in. But back to, let me just say one more thing about Kurt Cobain, and I want to go back to the story of No Song. The story of No Song, the betrayal there is that we find something at the edge. We find some numinous sacrality that informs us at the edge. And then sometimes when we step back into the center, we get forced into the role of the hero. The hero. And if you stay in that light too long, you're going to lose the connection with the edge. This is why the leaping again is so important. And No Song lost his connection with the edge. He was completely seduced by the attention, the approval, the acclamation that was given him by the people. And so in a way, the people betrayed him by adoring him. Wow.
Wealth that was visited or thrust upon Kurt Cobain when he was at the depth of that place, not able to contain what it might mean to go up or to be in a container. The dollars just were more ashes, and then there were piles of ashes. You know what I mean?
All right.